The growth of the debt on autopilot could destroy your financial future. Very few people actually understand the magnitude, the sheer size of America's national debt and the pending danger that it presents to all of us. This is an unprecedented crisis that threatens your personal standard of living, your job security, your family, your way of life, the stability of your community, and the future of this nation. This is not an overstatement. This is not an exaggeration. If people really understood the threat our national debt poses, they would march on Washington and demand immediate action. One of the reasons that people aren't more alarmed over the national debt is because its impact upon us has been shrouded, and so people don't really feel its impact. Most people are of the opinion of, well, yeah, America's in debt, but so what? What does it have to do with me? What does that mean to me? And still another reason that most people can't relate to it is that we hear things like $1 trillion, laid end to end extends to the moon and back, and analogies like that really mean nothing. We can't relate to them. It's an intangible concept that we can't relate to. So the size of the debt never really registers to most people. So please allow me to explain and simplify this issue using an illustration that we can all understand. Let's say that Sam makes $45,000 a year, but Sam is spending $61,000 a year, and he's borrowing $16,000 a year on his credit card to fund his excessive spending. It's pretty straightforward, right? But the problem is that Sam has been doing that for a long time, and so he's built up a huge balance on his credit card of $340,000. So how long do you think Sam can pay his monthly credit card payment on a $340,000 balance on a salary of $45,000 a year? Well, he grosses less than $4,000 a month, brings home a little under or over $2,400 a month. So how can he make a credit card payment of that size? Well, he can't. He can't afford to make his monthly credit card payments. Now, in the private sector, a bank officer who increased Sam's credit line so he could rack up a $340,000 credit card bill on a $45,000 a year salary would be fired, right? And in the private sector, this scenario wouldn't be able to continue because Sam would be bankrupt. So what does this analogy have to do with America's national debt? Well, the numbers here represent our national debt if you add 8 zeros onto the end of every one of these numbers. See, as of July 2024, our federal revenues are $4.5 trillion. Federal spending is $6.1 trillion, which means our deficit is $1.6 trillion, and our debt is $34 trillion. So you can see that in a very real sense, one can say that America is already bankrupt in that we owe more than we can functionally pay back. So if Sam in the private sector can't make his credit card payments, how can America make its payments? Well, because we have our own money supply. We have our own Federal Reserve banks, and we are just, in a sense, printing it. We're creating it out of thin air. More on that in a few minutes, but let's keep going to cover a few basic facts. First, you have to ask, to whom does the U.S. owe this $34 trillion? Well, about a third of it we owe to other nations who lend us money so we can pay our bills. About a little over a quarter of it we owe to other government accounts that loan the general fund the money to pay our bills. About 14% of it we pay to citizens and private banks that buy T-bills. About 13% of the debt is owed to the Federal Reserve as it manipulates the money supply. And about 12% of the debt is owed to state and local governments. Well, the next question is, how did we get here? How did this happen? Well, yes, some events caused drastic jumps in the debt, such as the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the 2008 stimulus. Remember the shovel-ready packages, the shovel-ready projects? And of course, there was COVID relief, which caused $6 trillion in national debt. But contrary to what most people think, it's not these one-time events that really drove the explosion of the debt. The real culprit is America's entitlement programs. Entitlement programs are benefits that go to people automatically just because they qualify. You get these programs because you are. If you're breathing and you're in a certain income or age category, you qualify. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security Disability, government food programs and housing programs. 49% of Americans receive entitlements every month from the government. And these programs are so massive and they're growing so fast on autopilot. They're growing faster than society's ability to pay for them. In fact, most people don't know this, but these programs are so big that they make up 60% of the government's budget. And Congress actually only decides about 16% of the non-defense discretionary spending. The rest is growing on autopilot. And as the baby boomer generation is retiring, millions of new illegals are straining these programs, and the cost of these programs are exploding. So next question. So why does having this massive federal debt matter? Why should you care? How will this impact you? Well, there's two major reasons why you should be very, very concerned about this. The first, because it's taking money out of your pocket every single month. This illustration shows how our federal budget is spent. Entitlements. You can see the amounts for specific categories of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, $558 billion, mandatory spending, and then interest on the federal debt. Defense. See, Congress only decides 16% of spending and everything else is on autopilot. So you can see about 17 cents of every dollar you pay in taxes goes to interest on the debt. And if we didn't have that debt, then that would be money in your pocket. So if you make a $100,000 gross salary and you're bringing home $62,000 net and you're paying $22,000 in federal taxes, you could keep 17% or $3,700 every year. So you could keep $300 a month. So on a $100,000 salary, you're paying about $300 a month on the debt every month, on the interest on the debt. But the second, and by far the most important reason that the debt is a danger is because the growth of the debt on autopilot could destroy your financial future. Let's look at this more closely. Simply by continuing on the status quo, by doing nothing to stop the growth in federal spending, the budget will look like this in a few years. You see, we're actually adding $1 trillion to the federal debt every 100 days. As mentioned, entitlements are exploding, expanding much faster than our ability to keep up with them. And Congress's refusal to touch entitlements prevents a course correction. Any attempt to deal with entitlements or slow the growth entitlements is demagogued as heartless and cruel. A few brave voices have been warning us for years that we'd better deal with this problem or it was going to deal with us. If we continue on our present course, even without additional increases in the rate of growth, by 2030, the debt is $52 trillion. By 2034, the debt is $60 trillion. And by 2040, the debt is $80 trillion. And because entitlements are growing faster than our ability to keep up with them, the numbers will be even worse than our numbers here. And that's without unforeseen emergencies such as a war or a national catastrophe that could push spending and borrowing even higher. So it actually could be much worse. So the next question, where is all this going? Where does this end? Well, the truth is we don't really know. No one knows. And this is because America has entered uncharted waters. It's hard to see how the country claws its way out of this or back from this. The word you'll hear experts use is unsustainable, that this is an unsustainable situation. But very few, if any, experts can explain what this really means in tangible terms. But it's pretty certain, unless something is done to change direction, by 2034, the debt will be $64 trillion and interest payments will be $1.6 trillion on revenues of less than $7 trillion, which is about 25% of our budget will be just interest on the federal debt. It's really hard to predict how it will impact us because this has never happened on this scale. Suffice to say, America is in uncharted waters. And this problem of just printing money and borrowing it is what will cause the long-term pain for all of us. increasing the money supply through quantitative easing has been criticized as creating the money out of thin air. And critics claim that this is what pushes the price of everything higher. Could this push us to hyperinflation? Well, some say we're getting pretty close to it right now. Sometimes it feels like it, doesn't it? And this is the real danger. Hyperinflation is where it rises faster than your ability to keep up with it. And what cash you have is worthless in a few years. And only those with hard assets like like land and gold are able to hang on. And now for the last question. Is there a way to avoid disaster? Can it be fixed? Well, there's only 3 ways this ends, and they're all painful. None of them are good. Option 1, default. America could decide to just issue a hard reset, and Congress could just decide to write off the debt as bad debt and start over. Of course, millions of people dependent upon government assistance would be immediately cut off, and civil unrest would immediately break out. So in a democracy where we have elections every 2 years, that isn't going to happen. So option 1 is off the table. Option 2, cut spending, or at least freeze spending so that we can get our hands around these entitlement programs. But this would require a national consensus that collectively as a nation, we all step up, be mature, and we're going to decide we're going to live within our means, and we're going to start living within our means and paying down the debt. And it would take decades. It would take 40 or 50 years, but it could be done if, that's a big if there's a will and if enough people are willing. And this is by far the preferred option and the only one that preserves the free market economy and the way of life that so many Americans have been accustomed to over the last, over our lifetimes. But again, this will require a national consensus of people willing to make tough choices today, for people that are willing to make financial sacrifices, to make tough decisions today. But the bad news is that so far, the attempt by some to do this in Congress has every single time been resoundingly defeated and demagogued as cruel and heartless. Which brings us to option 3. Which is by far the most dangerous, and that is a continuation of the status quo. Continued growth of the debt that is fueled by passivity and growth of entitlements on autopilot. And this path, if taken, will eventually lead to economic collapse because our interest payments on the debt will be so big that we won't have the ability to pay for much of anything else. And the only way to provide for the masses who are dependent upon entitlements will be to nationalize what profitable industries remain and move from a free market economy to socialism. We've seen what happens when nations move from a market economy to statism. Private property and companies are seized, freedoms are curtailed, the right to protest is removed, all in the interest of preserving the greater good. Now, we've seen this nightmare in other nations. And if America is to escape a catastrophe, then some hard questions and hard decisions need to be made right now. In a democracy, the American people will only choose the hard path of option 2 if they understand the hard path of inaction. If enough people are willing to sacrifice now in order to avoid catastrophe, then there is hope of avoiding the coming disaster. During World War II, the British people understood the coming threat. Hitler was at the gate, and the citizens of London knew that if they didn't pull together and do everything they could to avoid what was an existential threat, then they weren't going to make it. They were willing to bring their pots and pans into the streets, melt them down, and make bullets if needed in order to defend London against Hitler's army. Well, many, myself included, believe that Hitler is at the gate, only the villain is not a person. It's a circumstance of our own making. It's the federal debt. And if we do nothing, it will eventually overtake what's left of America's market economy. Previous generations of heroes fought and died to give us the opportunity to create the highest standard of living in the greatest nation the world has ever seen. To whom much is given, much is required. We have been given so much, and we have some hard choices to make. So please, educate yourself and your neighbors. Be wise, be smart, and let's hope and pray that Americans can come together to solve this, and soon, because the alternative is unthinkable.